So let's start with the first argument from contingency. So argument from contingency is a form of cosmological argument which argues for the existence of God, or in general for a necessary being. So traditionally, in contemporary philosophy of religion, you have actually more than 20 types of arguments, but traditionally the most famous or important 3 types of arguments were ontological argument, cosmological argument, and teleological argument. Cosmological argument argues from some general observation like motion, like existence of contingent entities, and I will describe what contingent entities are, or beginning of the universe, or existence of the universe. So basically that's why it's called cosmological. You take some cosmic observation, some basic cosmic observation, and you try to argue from it for the existence of God. The second type of argument is ontological argument, and it's the only argument which you cannot provide an empirical support. Science can never disprove or prove it, because ontological argument is actually a priori argument for the existence of God. You argue that God exists using just the concept of God. And a priori is like a mathematics, so mathematics is not influenced by what we do in science. It's an a priori science, it's a formal science, so no matter what happens in the physics, nothing will change in mathematics. So that's how the ontological argument is. So that's why Big Bang doesn't provide any support to ontological argument. And the third argument is teleological or design argument, which moves from some order in the universe, some order or some interesting phenomena or some purposeful phenomenon in the universe, and it argues that there should be a designer which designed that thing. So the third argument, which I will provide, the fine-tuning argument, is an example of design argument. So contingency argument is an argument, a form of cosmological argument. So the argument starts from the fact that contingent beings exist, and it tries to explain it with the existence of necessary beings. So let's present roughly the argument. So the argument, of course, can be a very rough presentation. You can basically formulate it more carefully, but here is the argument. The universe is contingent. The whole universe, the whole, what you see, all material things in the universe are contingent. And what is contingent? Contingent means that that object could easily not exist. It is possible for that object to not to exist. So that's what we mean by contingent. If something is contingent, it means it's perfectly possible that that entity couldn't exist. For example, I am a contingent being. If my mother and father decided that they don't want to have a child, I wouldn't have existed. So my existence depends on the choice of my father and mother. Basically, that's why a contingent being, because I can easily disappear, I can be destroyed, and I could not have existed. So everything which is possible not to exist is contingent. Very well. So the claim that the universe itself is contingent may seem to you like obvious, because you can think that the object of universe need not really exist. Well, not each people will buy this intuition. Some people may easily say, no, universe is not really contingent. Yes, some entities inside the universe like me are contingent, but does this imply that, let's say, the total energy in the universe is contingent? Does this imply that the total energy need not exist? How do you know? What's your proof? What's your argument for this? Well, this objection, which has been stated by some philosophers like Bertrand Russell, can be met now with Big Bang model. So this is where the Big Bang model comes into play. Basically, you can say that no, the universe we observe did not exist before 30.7 billion years ago, which means it has a beginning. So it is a contingent, obviously. If something has a beginning in time, it's a contingent entity. So basically, we can easily argue that universe is contingent being. So Big Bang model provides support to the claim that universe is contingent. Of course, in itself, this doesn't prove that there is God. you need to provide additional, as I said, reasonable assumptions. In this case, you have to put 3 more principles into a game. First, you need to show that contingency requires explanation. So if something could not exist, but if it exists, it means there should be an explanation why it exists rather than not exist. So this is the causal principle or principle of sufficient reason. There are different versions of this, but you have to put a principle which will ask for an explanation of contingent entities. And since universe is contingent, if it requires an explanation, if contingency requires explanation, it means the explanation, universe also should have an explanation. Of course, this in itself is not enough. You need to also demonstrate that it's impossible to have an infinite regress of explanations. Okay, suppose that each contingent entity has an explanation. Perhaps we have an infinite chain of contingent explanations. Perhaps there was some other universe before our universe. It disappeared, this universe appeared, and before it there was another universe. Each of them are contingent, each of them have a beginning and an end, but nevertheless, it explains everything, you may say. So you need to argue against this. You need to say that there cannot be an infinite regress of explanations. And there are different strategies you may use. You may argue that infinite is not possible, the actual infinite, or you may argue that while infinite is possible, it cannot apply to this regress, or you may say infinite regress is possible, and actually there may be an infinite regress, but it is not sufficient to explain the existence, the whole chain itself. It will still be contingent, and you will still require explanation of this. Anyway, if you can defend this, you end up with the conclusion that necessary being exists. And of course, necessary being as such is a being whose non-existence is impossible, and its existence does not depend on anything else. So this, the third point, you need to prove that this necessary being is God. So if you can do all of this, and I think this can be done, and you had a lecture, I think with Hamza, so you already discussed this argument, so you can formulate this argument. But here, Big Bang comes into play by providing evidential support, in fact, a strong support to the first claim that the universe itself is contingent. Okay, so far so good. This was the first argument. The second argument, again, which can be supported by Big Bang and which is usually openly argued for it, is the Kalam Cosmological Argument, or Hudud argument, basically, to argue for the God from the beginning of the universe, the fact that the universe began to exist. And it's obvious where the Big Bang comes into play. Again, in itself, here, Big Bang doesn't prove that God exists. You have 2 further steps you need to take. First, the Kalam Cosmological Argument argues that everything that begins to exist has a cause. This has nothing to do with the Big Bang model. So you need to argue for this. You need to provide a support that everything which began to exist has a cause. You need to somehow argue for it. Some people like Craig argues from metaphysical principles. You can argue from empirical observations. You can give some other arguments. I have one paper in which I argue for this premise, but you need to provide a support for this claim. Okay, if you can demonstrate that everything that begins to exist has a cause, then the second premise is universe began to exist, and this is where the Big Bang theory comes in. Basically, you can provide philosophical arguments for the claim that universe began to exist, and traditionally there are 2 different kinds of arguments. One which argues that actual infinite cannot exist. It leads to absurd conclusions if we assume that actual infinite exists. I don't personally like this argument for some reasons, but second, you can argue that it's impossible to form actual infinite by traversing, that's by adding 1 by 1. So if these philosophical arguments work, you can argue that universe must have a beginning independent of science. But of course, many modern people, especially if you are empirically oriented person, And many modern people are empirically oriented, which means they trust more observations than clear reasoning, just speculative reasoning. Then you may not be really convinced by these philosophical arguments, but now you have a scientific confirmation. Arguing that universe began to exist is not anymore just a philosophical claim based on some speculative argument. It's an empirically verified claim. Basically, the currently accepted scientific theory, the Big Bang theory, points that universe has a beginning. And therefore, if you combine these two premises, you end up that universe has a cause. Well, the story doesn't end here. So I said we need to defend that everything that begins has a cause. And I said there are actually two things you need to do. You need to also argue that the cause of the universe must be God of theistic tradition. And actually, in this case, it's very easy to do because you can easily see that the cause of the universe must be uncaused and eternal, since infinite degrees of causes cannot be infinite. It must be changeless and immaterial because the material itself, the matter itself was created later. It must be timeless because time starts with the Big Bang model or the beginning of the universe. Or at least if it is temporal, it must be some different time than the physical time. Of course, it must be immensely powerful because it caused the entire universe to exist. And it must be a personal being that is Zati. It must be a being which has purposes, because only beings with free will can have effects in time. They may just cause events in time by waiting for some time, or maybe waiting internally and come into a play. We saw the second argument, which is supported by the Big Bang model. And the third argument is the fine-tuning argument. So basically, fine-tuning argument claims that the conditions in our universe, and particularly the physical constants and initial conditions, are finely tuned to extreme precision to allow for the existence of complex chemistry, which is the requirement for the existence of complex life. If we change these values a little bit, and I will provide some examples, then the life, the chemical life, would not be possible. So it seems that the universe is designed by a being for the emergence of life. So this is a form of design argument or teleological argument. So how does Big Bang come into a play? It comes in two different ways. First, part of this fine-tuning is the initial conditions, the earliest state of the universe. It could easily have been different. And if it was different, then it seems the life would have been impossible, because the stars would not be able to form. And if stars cannot form, as we saw, you cannot have a complex elements like carbon, oxygen, or calcium. And if you cannot have them, you cannot have a chemical life. And we don't know any other kind of physical life besides chemical life. So it seems reasonable to assume that life is tightly bound to the initial conditions. And actually, you can make calculations and you can show that these initial conditions are balanced really tightly. Even a small change and life disappears. Here is an example, the expansion rate of the universe. So everything started with the Big Bang. And as I said, there is a dark energy being involved, which pushes the energies. So Big Bang could start with higher velocity, or it could start with smaller velocity. If the initial expansion rate of the universe was different, then things would turn out differently. So if it was much slower, the gravity would win at the beginning. So expansion started, gravity wins, everything collapses back to black holes before stars are being formed. And of course, no life emerges. If it's too fast, again, the atoms will be disintegrated, that they will be thrown away from each other before they can come together with the help of gravity to form the stars. And again, the life would not have been possible. And here you can go see really huge numbers, like one cosmological constant. If you, for example, take can see like fine tuning as 1 over 10 to the power of 100, which means 1 over 10 and 100 zeros after it. It's a huge, very small number, very small probability. Another example is, for example, the initial entropy. So energy started with incredible small entropy, with low entropy. So entropy, as you know, it increases with time. And the only way you can see the order at the moment you see in the universe is thanks to the initial conditions. Initially, the universe could start with very high entropy, in which case no ordered things will appear in the universe. So it must start with very low entropy for the emergence of stars. And that is precisely what happened. Here again, you can find some incredible estimations like 1 over 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 125, which means here you have 10 to the 125 digits, huge number, very small number. Even a little change at the initial entropy state and the life cannot emerge. Second support which comes from the Big Bang is actually more indirect. That's the fundamental constants. So we do know that in the universe there are special numbers. These are constant numbers which determine the basic physics, how the universe will work. These are inherent numbers in the laws of nature. Some of them are in the laws of nature, some of them are related with the matter. For example, the example of constants which are related with the matter is mass of the electron. In the vacuum, it is constant, and it was determined at the beginning of the universe, or mass of the quarks. The inherent numbers to the laws of nature are like big G, gravitational constant, or the strength of the nuclear force, speed of light, or the dimension of the universe, for example. We live in 3 + 1 dimensions, 3 spatial and 1 temporal dimension, and it could have been different. For example, we could live in 4 spatial dimensions, 10 spatial dimensions, and it turns out that if these dimensions are big, the other dimensions, we could be living, for example, in 4 or 5 spatial dimensions, but the other 2 are hidden. They are smaller than the atoms, so atoms cannot feel them. They're very small. If they were big and they existed, if we existed in 5 or 6 spatial dimensions, then life would have been impossible, because it turns out that stable chemistry is possible only in 3 spatial dimensions, which means life is only possible in 3 spatial dimensions, 1 in infinite actually. And again, these constants were determined at the beginning of the universe, at the event of Big Bang. So it's also tightly connected, the fine-tuning is tightly connected with the formation of elements or complex chemicals which happened in the stars. So to understand the fine-tuning argument, it is very crucial that you understand the Big Bang model. Then you can present this argument more clearly. You know what we mean when we say that it was impossible for life to exist if this was different. The difference is that stars in other conditions are not possible to exist, and it's stars which form the complex chemical elements which you require for the existence of life. Okay. Well, we saw that Big Bang theory can be used in conjunction with additional assumptions to defend existence of God using 3 different traditional arguments. Well, what else Big Bang can be used related with the theological matters? Actually, there are many things you can use, but I will provide 3 further examples. One is that you can use Big Bang against pantheism. What's pantheism? Pantheism is the belief that God and the universe are identical. God is not separate entity, but actually universe itself is God, or it has a special divine properties. Again, this view can be found in many traditions, in Europe, in Far East, especially in Far East, in some traditions, it's very common to see the universe in a pantheistic way. In Taoism or in Hinduism, some forms are close to pantheism. Again, Gaia and this kind of modern religious movements have pantheistic ideas in them. Well, Big Bang tells that universe has a beginning, and it again tells it empirically. What it implies that either we are going to deny that universe have divinity, because something divine cannot come, it seems reasonable, cannot come out of nothing. That is, it cannot have a beginning. If something has a beginning, it's not worth calling it God, because one of the essential properties of God is being eternal. Or they have to acknowledge that their divine object is not eternal. And again, this brings important questions. How can something which is not eternal be worthy of worship? How can it really be divine if it has a beginning? Even if we say that it's divine, we can argue that there's a cause which is even more divine, which is eternal. You can use Kalam Cosmological Argument in conjunction with Big Bang to argue against this pantheistic understanding. So Big Bang also kind of disproves or makes it very weak to believe in pantheistic God. Another important theological implication of Big Bang is, as we saw, if we fast forward the future of the universe, if we fast forward the Big Bang model, it's actually based on equations, lambda CDM model. If we fast forward it, it actually implies that universe will have an end. And again, this has an important theological significance, because theistic religions say that eventually the universe will end, at least life will end, and it will be recreated. There is a day of judgment. And basically, even though we cannot really say that, it provides extremely strong proof that there will be day of judgment, you need to again have a lot of additional assumptions which would be difficult to defend rationally. But nevertheless, you can say that Big Bang provides an indirect support for this, at least model, because most of traditional non-believers, non-theistic ideologies assume that universe is eternal. It will be eternal in the past, and it will be eternal in the future, into the future. But what this really shows that universe will have an end, like what is claimed by theistic religions. And actually, it has much deeper existential implications that universe will have an end. If universe have an end, it means everything in the universe will have an end, which means everything in the universe cannot have a deep meaning or deep divinity, or whatever we do, eventually it will disappear. Any cities, even if you want to, you can do something in space, eventually it will disappear. Everything will, in the long run, be destroyed. Everything is transient in the universe. And this has a deep existential implication. You cannot provide a meaning to your life by attaching to anything in the universe, because that thing will eventually disappear. If you want transient meaning, if you want something which will remain with you forever, that thing cannot be part of the universe. So if you want a real meaning in your life, you need to move beyond universe. So having end of the universe is very important existentially. So Big Bang provides support to this claim, and this claim changes the way we perceive the objects in the universe. And the third important implication for theology, in my opinion, there are more, but as I say, I don't want to bore you, and already the time is running out, is that Big Bang points to Tawhid, or radical monotheism. How? Why? Well, if you look, everything in the universe was created, every basic building block, so everything we see around us. Of course, you may argue that some things are even created in a sense by humans. We always use the building blocks in the universe to create these things. We are really not creating anything out of nothing. Right? We make computer, we use various elements around in the earth, we combine them and we make. So basic building blocks are already present. Even in CERN, when you create the small particles, you are using the energy in the universe. So, and everything was created in a single point, in a single instance. Everything begins with the Big Bang. This basically points that there is a single cause for everything in the universe. It will be not only redundant to assume that there is second cause, it will be irrational, because it seems that everything started from a single point in space and time. So basically, Big Bang kind of points to Tawhid, points us to the direction of Tawhid. Everything in the universe seems to have single ultimate cause. And this is something you cannot really see in the traditional arguments. Because suppose you have a contingency argument or design argument, you can always ask this question. Why assume single necessary being? Perhaps there are two different chains of contingent being, two contingent chains, which end up with two different or maybe three necessary beings. Of course, you may develop different arguments against these claims. You can provide, you can argue by different principles to point that there is single necessary being, but it's possible that you will have an objection that there are more than one necessary beings in these chains. Or again, you may argue that there is more than one designer. But in this case, all the parameters which are designed happened at the Big Bang point. And all the entities we observe, all the contingent entities we observe in the universe came from a single space-time point, which provides a strong reason to assume that there is a single necessary being or single designer. So Big Bang model not only supports this argument, but actually provides a reason to think that there is a Tawhid. Basically, there is a single necessary being and there is a single designer, and they are actually the same being because it all started at the same point. Anyway, because you can also sometimes say that designer and necessary being are different. Here, you also, Big Bang links these two arguments together, pointing that actually it's a single being. And strengths of both arguments are combined in this being. Now, you cannot not only say that necessary being exists, and you can also say that it's not a deistic God, because this necessary being is interested in humans and other living things by tuning the laws so that living things emerge. So design argument, cosmological arguments are can be interpreted as deistic arguments. When you have a design argument combined with them, it gets rid of the deistic possible interpretations. And deism is basically the claim that there is a God, but this God is not interested in the affairs happening in the universe, especially human life and other living things. Anyway, so thanks for your time. In the remaining 15 minutes, I want to take the questions you may want to ask about the things which we discussed. You can either ask directly or you may write it into a chat if you wish. Any questions, objections, comments?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to thank you for the presentation, Hocam. I'm from Turkey. So my question is, there is this divine action model that is very commonly supported in the Islamic tradition as well, the occasionalism.
Yes.
So accordingly, trying to prove the existence of God through ideas like the first cause or the impossibility of the infinite chain is actually unnecessary, because literally everything that happens in the natural world is explicitly an evidence for the existence of God. What do you think of that?
Well, I think this kind of reasoning has a problem. It assumes that everyone finds the same things reasonable. Well, it's not really true. Different arguments are appealing to different people. While an argument which moves from occasionalism may be found rational or let's say, may be found to be persuasive by some person, it will not be found persuasive by other person, which is maybe rational, and he may like, let's say, an argument which is based on design, on fine tuning. He may find that he's persuaded by cosmological argument. So arguments are human creations. We need to know this. There is no argument out there which you find. Argument based on occasionalism for the existence of God, or fine-tuning argument, or cosmological arguments, all are human creation. And they may be found persuasive by different people. So that's why I never believe that you need to go and search for one single argument and use it to convince people. Because different people have different backgrounds and they will evaluate different arguments differently. So that's why I don't believe that there is any single good argument we need to stick and let out the other arguments. All arguments are useful. And I think that some people, probably maybe you are trying to ask that, think that these other arguments kind of are not useful because they point to deistic kind of gods. You are saying that God created the Big Bang, or God designed the universe, and this is one aspect of God, and that's why these arguments are not good. Again, this mixes ontology with epistemology. You are not really saying that just because you're saying that God is the cause of Big Bang, you're not really saying that that's the only point that God is causally interacting with the universe. You are just finding out that there is a point of interaction, and you are finding out that there is a creator. But this creator may be engaged with the universe in different points, or maybe the whole points. Actually, occasionalism is perfectly compatible with argument of contingency, Kalam Cosmological Argument, or design argument. Simply, God is hidden in the other events. God creates the rain, but it's hidden. We cannot really, by looking at the rain, we cannot really go to God. That's the claim of some, that can be a problem. That's why you cannot really see the existence of God in the rain, but you need to go to the Big Bang. For some person, or again, some person may be persuaded by just looking at the rain and may think that there is a God or divine being, but not everyone. Other people find other arguments more persuasive.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, there's often a counter argument that's made by atheists regarding the fine-tuning of the universe, and what they say is that, well, because there could be so many other universes out there, each of them with their own values of the constants that you spoke about earlier. So basically, if you consider, I mean, we know that the probability that it will be finely tuned is such a low probability, 1 over a very, very big number. But what atheists will say is that there are equally that many universes out there, each one with their own value of the constant. Therefore, one of them has to have the constant that would bring about life, and that happens to be the universe that we're in. So, but what would be a simple way to respond to that?
Thank you very much. It's well, as you point out, one of the strongest objections to the fine-tuning argument is the multiverse objection. Well, there are two things I would use against this reply. First, I will point out that these models, not each multiverse model actually gets rid of the fine-tuning. And in fact, the most popular multiverse models, like quantum multiverse, that's the Everettian multiverse, or chaotic inflation models, they don't really have a mechanism which changes the constants of nature. Basically, in most of the multiverse models, each of the universes have the same constants. Each of them have 3 spatial dimensions, for example. Each of them have the same Planck constant. Actually, quantum mechanical equation has one Planck constant, and in Everettian multiverse, it happens in all the universes. So basically, by just saying there is a multiverse, you don't really solve the problem. You need to have a specific kind of multiverse in which there is a mechanism which changes the constants of nature. That's the first thing we need to know. Many people miss this point. And actually, you can, in popular books, popular apologetic or counter-apologetic books, people use multiverse models which don't have the mechanism to solve this problem. But can we really create a multiverse model which can do this? Yes. Adding string theory and some questionable assumptions, some speculative assumptions, you can create a multiverse model in which different universes have different constants of nature. And being speculative is not a real problem. Again, here, sometimes apologetics, Muslim or Christian, they will try to argue, well, this is not science. Well, yes, it's not really a science what we are doing at the moment when we think about the speculative multiverse models. But so what? God is also not science. So we are doing philosophy at the moment. So really not saying that it's not a science is not really an answer to this objection. But this mechanism itself, which changes the constants of nature, should provide energy to each of the universe, should create a space-time in each of them. And it should link, there should be a law which links these universes and changes the constants. This in itself would require a design, in my opinion. So this multiverse, which allows existence of universes with different constants, itself is a specific type of multiverse, and it requires a mechanism which changes the constants and separates these universes. For example, E is equal to mc squared should be valid for all these universes. There must be a way in which matter is created, so that there is electron in some other universe with different mass, an electron in the third universe with different mass, with different charge values. But this is not an easy thing. Such a mechanism itself would require a fine-tuning. So Robin Collins gives an example of bread creating machine. If you have a machine which creates breads, even that would require a mechanism which brings water, which brings fluor. It's not easy to have. So similarly, a multiverse which gets rid of the fine-tuning itself probably would be fine-tuned. The mechanism itself would be fine-tuned, and still we would require the creator for this system. And actually, we should be very careful to point out that one multiverse is not against the existence of God. In fact, we have a strong Muslim traditions which think that there are more than one universe, more different universes created by God. Actually, myself, I believe that God is constantly creating different universes. So multiverse in itself is not against existence of God, or in general against fine-tuning. One type of multiverse, one way to respond to me, what I said here, is to say that, well, it's just a brute fact that they are different universes. There's no mechanism which links them. Simply they are different universes. Everything which is possible exists in some universe. This reply is also possible, and some atheists actually make this reply. They say everything which is possible exists in some universe. So it's not that they are linked by some laws or mechanisms. Yes, if there is maybe a mechanism which creates these different universes, you may argue that it is fine-tuned, but these universes simply exist separately in different space-times. Well, this move, I think, also does not solve the problem, because if everything which is possible exists, and if God is possible, then God also exists in some universe. But since God is omnipotent, if he exists in one universe, he exists in all the universes. So actually, everything which is possible exists does not get rid of the God. And actually, if everything which is possible exists, certainly there are some fine-tuned designed universes, because they are also possible. If it was impossible, we wouldn't be having this conversation at the moment. So I don't think that also that strategy, which is a metaphysical multiverse strategy, will work. So that's my opinion in brief. So there is one question in the chat. Actually, it's answered. Maybe I don't need to answer it already. Ali has answered it. Any other question or comment? if there's no question or comment, maybe we can finish the session. Are there any hadith or Quran referring to Big Bang? Well, that's outside of my area of expertise. So I do know that some people think that Big Bang model is referred to in the Quran, as you know, that Quran talks about the expansion of the universe, or that so we created universe and we are expanding it, the verse, or the verse that heaven and earth, they were together, we separated it. So some people think that this hadith and this Quranic verse points to the Big Bang. Well, I'm not a tafsir scholar, so I'm not going to argue for and against these interpretations. However, I need to point out that we need to be careful to differentiate between observations and theories. Observations are simple events, and they may be referred by the Quran. Quran actually makes reference to some observations. For example, says that it's dark below the sea. And it's an observation. You can go and look whether it's dark inside the sea or not. But I don't think that you can find theories in the Quran. General theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, and Big Bang. Because it's against the nature of any book that it cannot really state a theory. Theories are mathematical entities. You need to give mathematical equations and a lot of details to put the theory in a book. And Quran by nature is not a mathematical textbook. If it really referred to quantum mechanics or general relativity, most people will not understand it. So what only Quran may be referring is some phenomena. For example, suppose Quran really refers that universe is expanding. It's possible, I think. It is not really referring to Big Bang. It's referring to an empirical observation that universe is expanding, which is predicted by the Big Bang, or you may say explained by the Big Bang, but it's not really referring to Big Bang. Or suppose that Earth and the heaven were together and they are separated. Well, again, this is a phenomenon. It's not really that it's a scientific theory. So I don't think that you can find scientific theories in Quran. It doesn't mean that you cannot connect Quran with scientific claims, but these claims have to be an observations, not really a scientific theories. Because scientific theories, you need to give a textbook, you need to give equations, or you need to give a lot of info, which would bring the book outside of its scope. Suddenly it should become a scientific textbook, which is not really the aim of Quran or hadiths or most of the science works. Okay, I think there is no question. So thank you very much for your time. Hope to see you in some other lecture in future. Take care.
Jazakallah khair. That was a very interesting lesson today.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Alaikum salam forever.